Hey class, welcome to Unit 4. And while in the earlier weeks of the course so far, we've been leading up to the point of where we're at now and been leading up to being able to compare groups and look at descriptive statistics between groups, talk about what's similar between groups and what's different between groups. We're now at more of the formal side of hypothesis testing in the course and coming up with your actual own research questions. I guess hypothetically more in this course, although it's something that what you do in this class could actually be used later on if you really do conduct your own research. But we just get more into the formalities of hypothesis testing. And while it sounds simple to just say, oh, come up with a research question, it can actually often be difficult. You have to make sure that your research question fits certain criteria, depending on what type of hypothesis test you're planning to do. You have to make sure you specify the variables and make it clear what variables you're going to use and are they measurable. You have to make it clear what your population or populations of interest are. So it often becomes tougher than you think. So it's a short video, but I just at least wanted to give you a little bit of guidance into the Unit 4 discussion where you will be creating your own research questions. And I wanted to go over some of the specifics with you. All right, let me go ahead and move this over here and pull up the Unit 4 discussion. Okay, let me, oops. All right, hopefully that's good enough. Y'all can actually see it on the screen. So the Unit 4 discussion is develop a research question in your area of interest. Think about what you're actually interested in so that this could possibly be something that's still useful to hang on to, even in the future in maybe future classes or, should you really decide to do research in your future. So make it something that you're interested in and think about a research question that could be answered using a hypothesis test for a mean. Now, this is where this is important because as you'll be learning throughout the remaining weeks of the course, there are different types of hypothesis tests for many different things. We might want to compare means or averages. We might want to compare percentages. In fact, in psychological research, a lot of people are interested in comparing rates and likelihoods. Answering questions like, are females more likely to suffer from abuse? Are females more likely to suffer from depression or vice versa? Are males more likely? So a lot of, when we think of questions like that, and we ask, are males more likely or are females more likely? Likelihood, probabilities, are percentages. And while those are great types of tests, interesting and really prevalent in the psychology field, we, over the next few weeks, are going to be focusing on tests for means. And if you think back to the earlier weeks of the course, we really only talk about means for quantitative variables. So that's, I think, one big thing that's going to make this a little bit tough this week is coming up with a research question where you are actually testing claims for quantitative variables. When we get to some of the latter weeks of the course, when we get to, let's see, I think Unit 8, and we learn how to do a chi-squared test, you'll get more into percentages. And there are many different types of tests that exist for percentages, some even beyond the scope of this course. But right now we're going to focus on quantitative variables and means. And for the next few weeks, we'll be learning different types of hypothesis tests specifically for comparing means. So that's what we want you to focus on. So your research question, you will talk about it in seminar, but you do have to make sure that it is a specific enough question that it's clear what variables you're going to be comparing and what groups you're going to be comparing. So if you look over here to the slide, I've got some examples of hypothesis tests for means so that can hopefully help guide you into being able to come up with an appropriate question. I think the main thing you want to try to avoid is coming up with qualitative variables that would have percentages involved because it's tempting. Students tend to do it a lot at this beginning stage of coming up with your own research questions. And like I said, it's not to say those would not be valuable research questions that you actually could do in your future. It's just that right now we're focusing on a special type of hypothesis testing for means. So example 1 over here, is there a significant difference in SAT scores for students who attend public schools and students who attend private schools? So this would be an appropriate research question for this particular week in the discussion. And the reason why, things to think about. First of all, our quantitative variable that we're interested in is SAT scores. That's quantitative. It's numbers. It makes sense to calculate mean or average SAT score. And specifically, it looks like we are comparing two independent groups, two different unrelated groups of students. Students who attend public schools and students who attend private schools. And as you'll learn this week, hypothesis testing is used to test claims. You know, maybe people are out there claiming that private schools, kids that go to private schools get a better education, they have higher SAT scores, you know, and that's something that there honestly is research that exists out there on that. But, you know, these are things that are easy to test. You would collect data and get a sample of students who go to public schools, a sample of students who go to private schools, and get their SAT scores and compare the mean SAT score of the public school students to the mean SAT score of the private school students. So that's a good research question for comparing means and testing a claim, you know, that has to do with comparing private schools and public schools in terms of their SAT scores. So that would be a good one. Example 2, do students who attend private schools score higher on the SAT than the national average of 1100? This is a similar research question, but what you'll find over the next few weeks is this one is what we call a one sample test, because we're only focusing on students who attend private schools. We're not interested in comparing them to any other groups of students. We're only interested in comparing them to a specific known national average value of 1100. So that is a one sample study. Example 1 would have been a 2 sample study where we would have compared a sample of students from public schools and a sample of students from private schools. Example 3, is there a significant difference in discipline problems for students with ADHD and those without ADHD? That is similar to example 1. Now we would have to specify how we're going to measure discipline problems because that's sort of vague. It's not real clear how you're going to quantitatively measure that. Well, maybe you might decide to measure it with maybe looking at number of discipline referrals that the students in your samples, because you've got 2 independent samples here. Maybe get the number of discipline referrals for the individual students in each of the samples and then compare the mean number of discipline referrals for both groups to see if in fact there's evidence that there's a significant difference. So what you're going to be working on then is stating the hypothesis. So once you come up with a research question, so you know any one of these would be a decent research question, but of course I encourage y'all to come up with a topic that you're interested in. Certainly does not have to be SAT scores. Think about in the psychology field, what are you interested in, and just try to tweak it to get it to be some sort of quantitative variable that you can measure, you know, quantitatively with a mean. So that's part A, is just coming up with your research question. And then it says explain what your research question is trying to investigate. In other words, you know, what is the goal of this study? What is it that you're really trying to get at? So just, you know, a few sentences just to say, okay, we see your research question. What really is your true goal of this type of study? State the hypothesis. So as you'll learn this week in Unit 4, you will be learning how to do a null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. You need both of them to, in one hypothesis test, you need both the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Then we're going to talk about whether your test, your hypothesis test, is one-tailed or two-tailed. And then we're going to just get you to think of a hypothetical p-value that you might get. Just pick a number, but p-values have to be numbers between 0 and 1 because they're probabilities. And then provide your expected decision and conclusion from your test based on this p-value. All right, let me try to pull up. Let me go to Paint so I can actually jot some stuff down for y'all. All right. So I want to actually walk you through the steps of the discussion and show you how you can do that for these. So let's actually look at example 1. Example 1 is the one where we were comparing public school students' SAT scores with private school. So part A would be this research question that you see over here to the left. To set up the hypotheses in part B, we'll set up both the null and the alternative. You need both. And since we're testing means, what you would want to do is define your first mean and define your second mean. So I'm going to call my first mean, and recall the symbol mu is just the symbol for the mean of a population. Even though we're only really collecting data on samples, we are making an inference about the bigger populations. So we use population symbols in our hypothesis test. So mu1, we're going to define it. I need keyword mean in there, and we're going to say mean SAT score for public school students. And you, of course, would just be typing all of this out in your discussion response. And then we will define mu2 to be the mean SAT score for private school students. Oops, running out of room there, but y'all get what I'm doing there. Mean SAT score for private school students. So once you define your mu1 to represent what I just wrote, and once you define your mu2 to represent what I just wrote, mean SAT score for private school students, then here's how you write the null, which is this first one with the HO symbol, and the alternative, which is the HA symbol. The null always assumes there's no difference. So our null here would be mu1 equals mu2, no difference, that the means are the same. And if we could, in fact, reach the entire population of all public school students and all private school students, that the mean SAT scores would be the same. The HA, alternative hypothesis, assumes there's some difference. And this is where you have to think about whether you're going to do a two-tailed test and just test for a significant difference without a particular direction, or if you're going to or if you're going to really test for a specific direction. Well, if the research question just says, is there a significant difference, so that you're not specifying higher or lower, then that's a two-tailed test. In fact, that helps you already answer part C. Two-tailed test. You're not specifying a specific direction. You just want to know, is there a significant difference? And when that happens, you're going to put the not equal to symbol in your alternative hypothesis. So that's how you do part B. Part C. Part D, you're going to pick a p-value. So like hypothetically, suppose my p-value is 0.021. Well, what you're going to do is take the p-value and compare it to 0.05. You will learn in your seminars why it's a 0.05 value, but that's the most standard value that we compare to, although it doesn't always have to be 0.05. So we notice here I'm picking a hypothetical p-value where my p-value is less than 0.05. And when your p-value is lower, it means your decision is to reject the null. And so your conclusion would be that you have sufficient evidence, and I'm out of room to write all that in, but your conclusion in your discussion would be that since your p-value is less than 0.05, you have sufficient evidence, you have enough evidence to say that there is a significant difference in mean SAT scores for students who attend public schools and mean SAT scores for students who attend private schools. If you had picked a p-value that was higher than 0.05, your conclusion would just be to say, I do not have enough evidence. I do not have sufficient evidence to say that there's a significant difference. You don't really want to go say that they're the same, because you'll get into a lot of that this week in your seminar, but you just don't have enough evidence to say that the difference is significant. You don't have enough, if your p-value is high. You don't, if the p-value is greater than 0.05, you just don't have enough evidence to say that there's a significant difference in the mean scores. So that's how you do it for example 1. Example 2, The key difference here, and by the way, example 1 and example 3 will be similar. So I'm not going to do example 3. I just, want to leave y'all up to practicing that in the discussion. But I will show you example 2 in case some of y'all come up with research questions where you're only, looking at one group. Okay, so in example 2, do students who attend private schools score higher? So what that means is now I'm testing a specific direction. I'm going to define my mean, and notice I only have one mean this time, so I don't need a mu1 or a mu2. I only have one mean. I'm only looking at SAT scores of private school students. So I define my mu to be the mean SAT score of private school students. And so for my null hypothesis, remember the null assumes no difference. So if we're comparing the value to the known national average of 1100, then my null hypothesis is going to say that the mu, which represents the mean SAT score of private school students, is the same as 1100. On the other hand, the alternative assumes a difference, but this time we're testing a specific direction for the difference. It said higher than. Do students who attend private schools score higher than? So now my alternative would be greater than 1100. That's the direction we're testing. You can talk in your seminar about why there's no less than symbol or why the null doesn't have less than or equal to. It could have that. It's usually accepted to just go ahead and put an equal sign in the null. So that's definitely up for discussion this week. As long as the direction that you're testing is in the alternative hypothesis. So mu greater than 1100. If you're testing just one direction, like greater than or less than or not equal to, those are all alternative symbols and have to go where the HA is. All right, and then, part C now would be a one-tail test. Why? Because you're testing just one specific direction. Only if we get mean scores in our sample that are much greater than 1100. And if that's the case, we'll have sufficient evidence that, yes, private school students do have mean SAT scores higher than that. But like I said, in a video, I just wanted to give you sort of the tips on the discussion. Part D, picking the p-value. Suppose this time I pick a p-value that's let's do 0.618. Clearly that p-value is greater than 0.05. So my conclusion would be to fail to reject the null. You only reject the null if your p-value is less than 0.05. So your decision would be to fail to reject the null. And your conclusion in context would be that you do not have enough evidence to say that the mean private school SAT scores are higher than the national average. You do not have sufficient evidence. When you fail to reject the null, you do not have sufficient evidence. When you reject the null, you do have sufficient evidence. So that's how you would write out your conclusion. And then, like I said, example 3 is similar to example 1. So I feel like hopefully with this much covered in this video that you've got enough background to at least have a good idea of how to proceed with your discussion this week. So good luck with your research questions, and hopefully y'all will clear up a lot of stuff. This is usually a tough week, but clear up a lot of stuff in your seminars.